Today I want to start by covering the different visual models for conditionals, and I do have a YouTube video on this topic, so it'll be a little bit of review. But after that, I want to talk about some good habits to develop when you encounter conditionals in logical reasoning argument. And that means things like anticipating how the conditional can be validly used or not validly used. And what you'll find is sometimes if you just read the whole paragraph, the whole argument very quickly, it takes you some time to even recognize that there was some kind of conditional error. But if you actually go line by line, and the moment that you feel like there's a conditional rule that might be used by the argument, if you already have an understanding of where the argument could go wrong in applying it, or what would be a correct way to use the rule, then you'll just be prepared more quickly to understand where the flaw in the argument is, because it may be already exactly what you were thinking as you were just thinking about the conditional rule. All right. And then afterwards, we'll take a look at some examples, including ones that I've written myself, and then hopefully work through about 5 or 6 real logical reasoning questions that are more, well, there's a range of difficulty this time. It won't just be all difficult stuff, but it'll be from all kinds of difficulties. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. And feel free to ask any questions if you'd like as we go through this, of course. So, with conditionals, I think we're all familiar with the traditional arrow notation, right? If X is true, then there's an arrow that leads to Y. That's one way to represent a conditional statement. But remember, there's other ways to mentally visualize a conditional. One of them is the idea that the sufficient condition, the if part, is like a small circle within the Y, the necessary condition part. And you should think about some examples of your own that may fit very easily into this structure. Because if you can do that, then this will be very easy to call upon when you're understanding really any conditional. I like to think about geographic rules. So like if you're in New York City, then you're in New York. Or if you're in Shanghai, then you're in China, right? Those are very easy to fit into this type of structure. But try thinking about many other kinds of conditionals in this same way, because it's not just reserved for those geographical rules. All right. Another useful mental model, I think, is the partial list of requirements. This one I find can be helpful when you have a statement that's talking about that uses the word unless, because unless is often used to introduce one requirement in order to do something. So maybe the statement, you won't be healthy unless you eat green vegetables, right? You won't be healthy unless you eat green vegetables. That means eating green vegetables is just one of the requirements that you know about to be healthy, but there could be other things that you have to do, right? You might have to reduce your fat intake. You might have to exercise as well. And so try to think of some other examples of your own that might fit this. If you're a student or have recently been a student, sometimes it's easy to think about requirements in order to get into a particular class, or in order to maybe like finish your major, right? In order to graduate with honors in political science, you have to write a thesis, right? But that doesn't mean that everyone who writes a thesis is going to graduate with honors, right? Maybe there's some credit requirement or GPA requirement. So I find those kinds of statements easy to visualize using this type of structure. There could be many other requirements that you just don't know about. All right. And then the final model that I think is often really helpful is thinking of the X, the if part of a conditional rule, as just one way to get to the necessary part. But there could be just many other ways that get to the same place. I think this particular model is the most broadly applicable. So in general, probably almost any conditional statement could be usefully viewed like this. And when it comes to understanding many of the traditional conditional errors, like the mixing up sufficient and necessary, going backwards on the arrow, things like that, I think that this model is a good way of helping to understand why those are flaws. All right. Let me go ahead and go to some good habits to develop, just some good things to do when you encounter conditionals in a logical reasoning stimulus. So the first thing that is often helpful when you encounter a conditional is to think about the kinds of conclusions that you could validly draw based on that conditional, as well as the kinds of invalid conclusions that someone might try to make based on a conditional. Before we look at the examples that I brought up, I want you to take some time to think about that yourself. You know, if you have the rule, if X then Y, if that's one of the premises of an argument, what are the valid conclusions that one could draw based on that? And go ahead and type that in the chat if you know what I mean by that. If you have the conditional if X then Y, there's two conclusions that you could potentially draw based on that conditional. So that's right, Reina is saying you could conclude if no Y, then no X. Yeah, that's the contrapositive. And of course, both of you are giving me the more difficult one, right? The more straightforward one is you could conclude Y, right? So don't forget that. If the conditional is if X and Y, you could, if the conclusion is Y, then that potentially is something you could reach. All right. And so that's what I've represented over here. The valid conclusions based on the conditional if P then Q. And, just in case you're not familiar with this notation, oftentimes, when people are breaking down arguments, they'll draw a line and then they'll put below the line the conclusion of the argument. So that's what I've done here. These are the two ways that you could validly use this conditional to reach a conclusion. And so, if the argument you're reading does actually reach one of these valid conclusions, then that's going to cause you to think about certain issues that are not related to mixing up sufficiency and necessity, right? Because this argument is not necessarily making an error with their use of the conditional. The issue could instead be they didn't give you the information that you would want to actually trigger the conditional. Perhaps the argument is making some shift from one idea to another idea. And so we'll take a look at some examples of that. The invalid conclusions, though, if you get a conditional statement and you see that the author is trying to conclude that the if part is true, that P is true, or if you see that the author is trying to conclude that the then part is not true, that Q is false, then you already know one of the errors they're making is they're confusing the necessary condition and the sufficient condition. They're reading this statement backwards as if it said that P was required for Q. All right. So that's not necessarily the only flaw in whatever argument is being presented, but you'll know that that's one of the flaws that's being presented, and very commonly the one that the LSAT will be asking about. All right. But, you know, in addition to thinking about the valid and invalid conclusions, it's also helpful to think about what are the valid and invalid ways to trigger the conditional, right? And so if you have the statement, if X, then Y, then if you understand that, then when you continue reading, you might already have in mind, okay, so if they tell me X, then they should be concluding Y. Or if they tell me that Y is not true, then they should be concluding that X is not true. And so you already have this understanding of what the correct way the rest of the argument should go is. And when the argument starts to veer off from the correct path, it'll just be easier to notice when they're doing that. All right. And so, this is what I mean. If you have, the conditional if A, then L, and then you see a premise that says A, well then you know the conclusion is supposed to be L. So if they try to conclude anything that's not L, anything different from L, you know that one of their assumptions is that that thing, or rather, one of their assumptions is that L leads to that thing. All right. And it'll be easier when we look at some actual English language examples. All right. So if you know the conclusion is supposed to be L, but then they conclude F, for example, then you know they're assuming that L leads to F. Similarly here, this is another way to validly trigger this rule, right? It's the contrapositive. If you know that if A is true, then that requires L, then that means if they say not L in the premise, what do you know the conclusion is supposed to be? It's supposed to be that A is not true. So if they say something else besides that idea that A is not true, then you know the assumption is that they think that A not being true leads to that new idea. All right. And then in addition, here are the invalid ways to use a conditional. If you have the conditional if D, then H, well, if the premise starts off by saying not D, you already know that there's going to be some sufficiency and necessity mix-up, right? It actually doesn't really matter what the conclusion is. You already know one of the flaws is going to be that there's a mix-up of sufficiency and necessity. Now, there could be other flaws on top of that too, on the harder problems. Same thing with if you see the premise is H, right? If you see that the premise is H, then there's nothing that they can do with this conditional to reach a valid conclusion, right? H is not going to allow you to prove that D is true, that the if part is true. So you would already know before you even read the rest of the argument that there is a conditional error, all right? And so if we get used to anticipating the valid and invalid ways to use conditionals, then it starts to become a little bit easier, I think, to evaluate conditional arguments. And so by that, I just mean asking these questions, right? So when you see that an argument seems to be using a conditional as a premise, well, the first question that I would have in mind is the argument using the conditional properly? And I refer to the structure. Like, are they reaching a conclusion that you could actually reach based on the conditional? Are they triggering the conditional in a way that actually could trigger the conditional? Or are they reaching an invalid conclusion? Are they trying to use the conditional in an invalid way? Because if they're trying to reach an invalid conclusion or using the conditional in an invalid way, like the ways that I showed you up here, then you would already know one of the issues is mixing up sufficiency and necessity. But on the other hand, if the way that they're trying to use a conditional seems to be okay, right, the structure of it is okay, then the flaw in the argument is going to be somewhere else, right? And so here's some of the things that I'd be thinking about. Well, if the conclusion that they're drawing is something that could be valid, does the argument give us to know enough to know that the conditional is actually being triggered? And so take a look at these examples over here. If we have the conditional rule, if K then M, then in this first example argument, DCM, that is something that I could validly conclude, right? But what's the information that I would want to prove that M is true? What's the information that I would want to prove that M is true? Well, I would want to know that K is true. So if they don't tell me that K is true, then there's going to be some kind of assumption that K is true, right? And so do you see how that can allow us to place into context what this premise is doing? Why does the author think that L is true actually proves that M is true? They seem to think that L being true leads to K. Does that make sense? And you basically, to evaluate the argument, it's like forget about the premise they actually gave us for a moment. Let's just understand the kind of conclusion that they're trying to reach. They're trying to reach M, and we can reach that conclusion if we know that K is true. So then the next question to me is, okay, do they tell me that K is true? Well, they don't do that. So that must mean whatever they did tell me, the author thinks leads to K being true, or is like a stand-in for K being true. All right. So something similar is going on to the right argument here. So do you see, if the conclusion is not K, that is a valid conclusion that I could reach, right? But what's the information that would prove that K is not true based on this rule? If I knew that M was not true, if I knew that the necessary condition for K was not true, that would prove that K is not true. And so then the next question for me would be, do they tell me that M is not true? Not exactly. They say that J is true. So the issue in the argument is the author thinks that J being true proves that M is not true. Here's another issue that might come up, another way to think about what happens if the argument seems to be using the conditional validly, right? There's nothing wrong with the way the structure of the argument is. So if the rule is validly triggered, then we should be thinking, okay, well, do they reach the right conclusion? Do they reach the kind of conclusion that I could draw? Or is there a jump to a different concept or a shift? Because if there is, then that tells you what one of the assumptions is, right? So take a look at this argument. If R is true, then T is true. So if I'm reading this and I see that the one of our premises is R being true, then I would already be thinking, well, the conclusion should be T is true, right? Because if R, then T. So what's the actual conclusion they gave me? Is it that T is true? No, it's actually that Y is true. And so that would tell me, okay, so the conclusion they should have reached was T being true. They must be assuming that T being true leads to Y being true. It's like the same thing as Y being true. All right? Same thing with the argument on the right. If I got this conditional, if R then T, and then I see a premise that says T is false, then ideally, before you even process or read the conclusion too deeply, you would want to recognize, okay, the appropriate conclusion to reach is that R is false, that R is not true. Is that what they tell me? No, they tell me that G is false. So they must be thinking that R being false, which is the appropriate conclusion, somehow means the same thing as or leads to G being false. Does that make sense? Let me know if you have any questions about the way that I'm working through these examples. Basically, it's stuff that if you have been practicing logical reasoning, I'm sure you've done this from time to time. It may not be something very difficult for you depending on your experience, but I'm just kind of emphasizing that it's totally appropriate and perhaps even a good thing to go line by line and to actually just stop to predict the direction in which the argument could go. What are the good ways, the valid ways the argument could go, and what are the invalid ways the argument could go? Because if you already recognize that, then it already just helps you understand where the flaws in the argument are going to come from. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples, and I want you to take a look at these 3 examples on the board right now. So all of these examples have something in common. What's the thing that they all have in common? Matt, you're saying assume there's only one way for the outcome to happen? Yeah, so that's another way of saying they're mixing up necessary and sufficient conditions, right? The first one probably is the easiest to understand, right? If you shoplift, you'll go to jail. Paul did not shoplift. Then the argument tries to conclude he won't go to jail, but that seems to be assuming shoplifting is the only way to go to jail, when it only said that shoplifting was one way one of many different paths towards getting to jail, right? So depending on, what other materials you've used to study, you might call that, and this argument is like the inverse. You might say that this argument is doing like a mistaken negation. Doesn't really matter exactly what you call it. What's important is recognizing that it does have that structure, right? And here I'll use A and B. If A, then B. The next premise, Paul did not shoplift, is like saying not A, right? And the conclusion is saying, therefore, not B. But B could still be true. He could go to jail for other reasons, right? What about the second example? Did you guys recognize that it actually is a similar argument, isn't it? How come we can't conclude that she won't get academic honors? I mean, doesn't the rule say students are in the top 10% of their class on graduation will get academic honors, and she's in the middle, right? So why doesn't that mean she won't get academic honors? Can you guys think about that? Others can also get honors, right? Maybe there's another rule that says, like, if you're in the top third, or sorry, not the top third, we'd have to make it median, right? But maybe actually this is probably true at a lot of the grade inflated Ivy League schools. What if the top 70% of the class gets honors, right? That's a possibility. So the top 10% gets honors, but also the top 70% gets like cum laude. That's definitely happening, right? And also, yeah, right, you could be getting honors for some different type for a different reason, right? It's maybe not about GPA. Maybe it's about some other kind of commendation or distinction, right? Now, because we're examining this one at a time, I think it's not that difficult to spot what's wrong with this argument. But I don't know if you would agree with me on this. I have a feeling that the second example here, it's like a little bit harder to just quickly and automatically grasp compared to the first one. And so maybe this particular example isn't like that for you. But sometimes what happens with the LSAT is they will create an if-then rule, right? They'll create a rule that almost seems like in real life it's like a biconditional, like it goes both ways. Like there's a part of you that wants to read this as saying only the top 10% will get academic honors, right? And so if you have sometimes found that you fall into that trap, unfortunately, the solution is, well, to go line by line and to remember that the LSAT is asking us to break down the language and the structure of the sentence. It's not so much about what is typically true in real life. And that's one of the most difficult things about the test, I think, is to just read things literally. And because, in real life, probably there would be some kind of pamphlet that sets out the rules. And even though there's no part of it that says these are the only people who qualify, that's kind of the shared understanding that you would have based upon reading those rules, right? Okay, this last example though, this one's interesting because it's nonsensical, right? Why do you think I created a nonsensical example here? Because I think it's important to understand the structure of the argument and how you can still be confident in what the flaw is, even though you don't understand the content, right? You still understand the structure. So what's the conditional rule that this last example is providing? Can you guys spot what the if-then rule that the argument's trying to use in this last example? This one right here, right? And can you guys tell me what's the sufficient condition or the if part of that last sentence? So Raina pointed out only if earlier. We don't see only if, but we do see only when, right? And so you could think of this as purple clouds gather is like if. It's the A. Angry chameleons wear temporary feathers is like the B. And do you see, they do give us some irrelevant stuff, but there's another premise that says the clouds that are purple are not gathering. So they're trying to say not A, and then the first sentence is a conclusion. So they're trying to say, therefore, not B. LSAT problems, are not they're not devoid of content. So I don't think you can ever completely ignore content. Sometimes the difficulty will be there are these content shifts that were meant to either see is like a jump, or to recognize that maybe it seems like a content shift, but it's really the same idea, even though they use different words. So this type of purely abstract argument, it adds one kind of difficulty, but it also takes away another kind of difficulty that the LSAT adds. All right. So let's take a look at just one or two more examples before we turn to some actual logical reasoning problems. Take a look at these two, and then tell me what they have in common. So, what do you guys notice about these arguments here? Can you see the structure underlying this, what the arguments are trying to do, how they're trying to get to their conclusion? How would you describe what's going on in these arguments? Yeah, so Meng is saying unstated assumption is not B. Yeah, in the first one, we have this rule that says in order to win re-election, the president must be in good health. And the word must there is telling us that's a necessary condition, right? So that's like if A, then B. And then they're trying to get to this conclusion. Now there's a little bit of a shift in the conclusion, right? I'm going to translate that as not A, but do you see how if you were being really particular about the precise wording and maybe didn't recognize the structure of the argument, you might not realize that expecting a transition to a new presidential administration is like, it would lead to the idea of or it's like the same thing as not being reelected. Does that make sense? So actually I want to correct myself. The structure of it is, and here I'm going to be using what I talked about earlier, like, okay, so if B is not true, then the conclusion should be that you can't win, or the person won't win re-election. So now they say something slightly different from that, right? We can expect a new presidential administration. So I guess that's the idea is if you don't win re-election, then that means you're going to have a new presidential administration. And that I think is supposed to be an okay jump. It's not really a difference in concepts. It's really the same concept described in different ways. So that's why I would say not A. All right. But the missing assumption is that the president is not in good health. Now, the second argument here is doing the exact same thing, right? But in a much more complicated way. The premise part is the second half, right, of the stimulus, because it's saying we know this because, so that's going to introduce a premise. And the if part is saying maroon theories, if they are to have any shape that is not circular. And so here I'm going to, instead of just translating it to A and B, it's a little bit difficult. I'm going to start with, like, if it's not circular, if those theories are not circular, then these t-shirts have to be popular. So I'll just write t-shirt popular. Okay, so now if the conclusion is they're not rectangular, that's interesting, right? This is something that the LSAT will do. They know that people are really into diagramming. But if someone just said, okay, so not rectangle, then it doesn't make any sense at all, right? There's no connection between any concept at all. So what's actually going on here? Well, let's see. If this conditional would allow us to say that if the t-shirts are not popular, then those theories are circular. So do you see how the theories being circular, it seems to lead to the idea that they're not rectangular, right? Because something can't be both circular and rectangular. I mean, maybe that's a scientific fact. Maybe that's an assumption the author is making. I don't know exactly what I would label that. It seems like just by definition, you can't be both circular and rectangular. But if we can understand that that's what the argument's trying to do, we can better understand what the missing piece is, right? They seem to be trying to say, therefore, the theories are circular, which is why they then make this second shift, and maybe it's a totally appropriate shift to saying it's not rectangular. But the underlying issue is they're trying to say the necessary condition is not true, all right? That the B is not true. This is the missing piece from both arguments, that the necessary condition is not true. All right. Does that make sense? I hope that's not too difficult. It's actually something that LSAT will do all the time. All right. Any questions about this so far? So I just want to add one more piece then before we turn to some real problems. What do you guys think about these two examples? So think about what these have in common, if you can see anything they have in common. And think about how you would describe what these arguments have in common. Anyone want to share their thoughts on this? It's a similar argument to the previous examples, right? We need an assumption to get to the conclusion. That's right. Can you think more specifically about what that assumption is? And I know that these are two different, totally different arguments in terms of content. So can you think about the structure, what they're trying to do here? First, you could probably see that they are basically trying to do that contrapositive structure, right? Like the previous one. In order to win re-election, the president has to be in good health. The conclusion is basically that the president won't win re-election, right? So if this is going to be a good argument, I want to know that the president's not in good health. Is that what they tell me? They say that he won't participate in public debates. So what's the missing piece here? That the other premise they're giving me, that he's not participating in public debates, that means the same thing as, or that leads to the idea that the president is not in good health. Does that make sense? Structurally, what's happening here is we still have the if A then B premise, right? That's the first one. We still have the conclusion that A is not true, but what the LSAT is doing is they're throwing in this other idea, and I'll just call this other idea X. We're meant to understand that the author thinks X proves that B is not true. The missing piece that I'll write off to the side in parentheses to signify that it's missing is that X leads to B not being true. Does that make sense? Now this occurs so often, this structure, that, I want you to understand it to a point where you don't need to draw out the diagram like this. Maybe you can already visualize it. But the point is that they can add difficulty by just throwing in these other premises, and unless you actually understand the conditional structure, what they're trying to do with the conditional, it may actually be very difficult to see the relevance of those other premises. That was my intention in coming up with this second example, right? So we still have that conditional rule in the middle, right? If scientific theories are to be not circular, then these t-shirts have to be popular, right? That's like the if A, then B. The conclusion is still that the maroon theories are not rectangular. So again, we have that difficulty of what is not rectangular? Oh, so they seem to mean it's circular, which is what shows it's not rectangular. So the conclusion really is that the theories are circular, right? But what's the relevance of this very last sentence? Furthermore, it is clear that the alligator has flown to the chicken coop. What does that have to do with anything? Well, they're offering me that premise as the X that's supposed to prove the necessary condition is false. That's supposed to show me that these t-shirts are not popular. So that's why the missing piece is, if the alligator has flown to the chicken coop, then t-shirts showing those 3 wolves howling to the moon are not popular, right? So pretty difficult because of the nonsensical nature of the content here. But what I'm trying to do is show you how the LSAT will make things difficult is, if you do not recognize that conditional structure and what the author's trying to do with the conditional, it's almost impossible to understand what this other premise is supposed to be doing. And that often is what's happening in the really difficult problems, is because you didn't see the conditional nature, then the rest of the argument just doesn't make sense. And you'll see that there will be so many wrong answers that are just playing off of completely irrelevant things that have nothing to do with the conditional aspect of the argument, because the problem's difficult when you don't notice the conditional aspect. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at some actual questions now, and you can see a lot of these ideas in action. All right.